Hello everyone, welcome. This is the second talk on the history of the Middle East, as it were. Okay, the first one I gave you a very short summary of the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and I stopped at the British Mandate. And I thought that perhaps today I would go a little bit more into the history of the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire and Egypt and so on. Why? Well, first of all, you're getting the news of what is happening from just about everywhere else. And we have time, so I decided to go a little bit more slowly and give you a little bit of the history of the whole thing, because you see, it's not only the Western European powers and the Arab land and the Arab world and the Muslim world that we have to take into account here. It's the what came before, the Ottoman Empire, which ruled that part of the world, and it will reach its peak, and then, as all empires, the decline. And the decline came from the European provinces of the Ottoman Empire becoming independent, but it did not affect at that time the Arab world. But there would be revolts eventually against the Ottoman Empire, and the conflict was, you see, in the revolts and the revolutionary movements. There were three things here that complicated the issue. It was, first of all, your own your own land and the borders, a nationalistic spirit there, but also what to do about the pan-Arabic or the pan-Muslim side of it. You could look at it from three different angles, and that is why the whole thing was rather complicated when the European powers came in. I just thought, since we have the time, as I said, what is happening at the moment, you have many other sources. I am not the best one to deal with that I would take you through this history, which I find fascinating anyway. Look, okay, let's start. So I think it will probably I will do perhaps four videos on this, and this is the second one. Okay, for some 2 centuries after the Sultan, that is the Ottoman Emperor, as it were, Muhammad II, conquered Constantinople, Istanbul of today, in 1453. The Ottoman Empire was the scourge and the envy of Western Europe. By the end of the 16th century, the island of Crete surrendered also. So now the Ottoman Empire included all of Turkey, obviously, but all present-day Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Cyprus, Albania, Yugoslavia, today Serbia, the ancient Yugoslavia, parts of Hungary and Poland, and the Russian Crimean coast. There was a war there about that Crimean coast between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. This was the peak of the empire, and although they once almost reached the gates of Vienna, they never succeeded in taking it, though. Okay, it was by the 17th century already in decline. The decline began perhaps in the Christian provinces with the defeat of the Turkish forces by King John Sobieski of Poland in 1683. And the European Christian powers went now on the offensive. During the 18th century, the Ottomans suffered defeat 3 times, for example, at the hands of the Russians. Why do we ever go to war with Russia? Okay. These losses had only affected, as I said, the Christian provinces, but not the Arab provinces of the empire. In 1798, the young Napoleon Bonaparte, popular, triumphant after his crushing defeat of the Austrian armies, proposed to the Directorate that he should strike at the very source of France's arch enemy, Britain's wealth and power, by occupying Egypt and threatening therefore the route to India. The British at that time saw Egypt only as a stopping in, as it were, between on the route to India. France, in his mind, was to lead the way now in a European penetration, he said, of the ancient and mysterious East, the link between the Mediterranean world and the African and the Asian continents. In the secret decree of 12th of April, 1798, one of the aims of the Egyptian expedition, Egyptian expedition he sent, was to arrange the Isthmus of Suez and cut through it to ensure, quote, the free and exclusive possession of the Red Sea for the French Republic. Napoleon himself visited Suez, but unfortunately his engineers had miscalculated the whole thing and told him that it was impossible to do anything with the Suez Canal as we know it today. So he abandoned the idea. But although this whole thing was a failure, Napoleon attempted to appeal nevertheless to the Egyptians, and he used to dress as a Muslim. Napoleon dressed as a Muslim, which was unconvincing. But this whole episode was important in 2 ways, you see. Britain had been concerned for a while about its Indian possessions. That's true. But at this time, it was the Russian expansion that was seen as the real danger. And when Prime Minister William Pitt in 1791 first laid the foundations for its for England's Near East policies, which were to last for 100 years, the crucial thing here was that the Ottoman Empire should not be allowed to disintegrate. It was against England's policies, interests, just in case its ports fell into Russian hands. So they didn't want the Ottoman Empire to break up because they were more afraid of Russia at this point. But from the Napoleon expedition, things changed a little bit, though, because it was now France that was seen as the principal menace here. And this began the long Anglo-French rivalry for political control over Arab lands. Britain signed its first treaty of protection with an Arab ruler, the Sultan of Muscat. Muscat was at the time the capital of Oman until 1970. It borders with Oman United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Yemen now. And he, the Sultan, gave Britain exclusive rights on his territory. As always, it was for Britain the security of its route to India which had made England the world power. And it was really what mattered most to the British government at the time. Britain had not yet realized what Napoleon said when he was in exile, that actually Egypt was the most important country in the area. The other significant point about Napoleon's expedition was, let us say, psychological or cultural, on the impact that the French had on the Egyptians, and through the Egyptians to all the Arab peoples in the Ottoman Empire. Such a short period of French rule could not, of course, break or transform deeply entrenched institutions and habits and customs of Egyptian society, but it planted a seed that would grow. The French have always been very good, especially at that time, through their education sophistication, when they went to foreign lands, to make other people admire them or imitate them to a large extent, especially the upper classes. Remember Dostoevsky in Russia used to complain so much in the 1850s and even before that about the Russian intellectuals imitating the French. He was on the side of no. Why do you want to be an imitator? Be the real thing. Just be Russian. Perhaps we have our shortcomings, but at least you are yourself. You're not an imitator of someone else. But the French were very good at creating this idea of superiority that others wanted to emulate. And many fell for it. The only one, this is my personal opinion, I like to watch these things, you see. I even watch them now interact. The exception to this were the English. Imagine the sophisticated Talleyrand, okay, French, okay, but the English never fell for it. The English were right saying, oh yes, that's very interesting what you're saying. Now let's change the subject to some. They never accepted, certainly not inferiority, but even equality to a certain extent. Watch them now, even today, how they interact, the French. Anyway, I like to watch these things. Anyway, but let's go back. It was not only the military and technical and scientific superiority of French knowledge here that struck the more open-minded members of the elite Egyptian society, but it was this French attitude, the independent spirit, as they saw it, of the French soldiers, the egalitarian ideas of the French Revolution, this sophistication that was the first sort of penetration of into the Near East, as it were. The Ottoman authorities were naturally appalled and outraged that French revolutionary ideas would take hold among the elite with their overtones of secularism and atheism, and that they should have penetrated the empire, but they were really now unable to immunize it, immunize it from their influence. Now, enter one leader, extremely important, called Muhammad Ali. Yes, Muhammad Ali. Okay, in 1805, he was a member of the Ottoman elite. Am I still on here? Something came up. Sorry, something came on my computer. I think I'm still on. Okay. And in 1805, he was a member of the Ottoman elite, but they sent him to Egypt as a sort of a viceroy, as the leader there. And he was the first one to actually defeated easily a British expeditionary force that had been sent there. Now, the attitude towards this leader, Muhammad Ali, of that most modern Egyptians had is a little bit ambiguous. He was not Egyptian. He never learned Arabic. He looked at the Egyptians with a certain degree of disdain and contempt. No personal love or sympathy for them. His driving force was his political ambition and his career, and he was ruthless in his methods against any revolt or anything like that. But nevertheless, the other good side of it was that he built industries. He actually set Egypt on the road to industrialization. During the 40 years of his rule as Pasha of Egypt, between 1805 and 1849, 1 million new acres of land were brought under the plough. New irrigation works were completed, including the Great Nile Barrage, and also established the basic form of government. One of his greatest achievements was on education. Even though the ulama, the scholars of Islam, had put him there in a sort of put him there really, he ignored them from then on, and he opened new secondary schools where mathematics, technical subjects, and Italian were taught. Italian because it was the language of commerce at the time. They were taught by foreign instructors, though. But he founded colleges of medicine and engineering and sent students to Europe for further training. But he did import foreign instructors. The connection, therefore, established between him, Egypt, and Bonaparte was maintained. And most people in key positions were actually French. It was part of his achievement, however, that he never allowed this outside influence to become excessive. He was savvy, and unlike his successors afterwards, he never became subject to European political control himself or indebted to European bankers. He turned Egypt, which had been an enfeebled and impoverished province of the Ottoman Empire, into a Mediterranean power at the time. And King Farouk of Egypt, who abdicated in 1952, he was his great-great-grandson. Not going to go into every fight and every revolt, but though he had wars and skirmishes in Sudan, in Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula and so on, it would not be right, it would be a grave error to regard some of his challenges to the Ottoman sultans, not against the Turks. Arab nationalism at the time was an almost inconceivable idea. He himself, as I said, was a member of the Ottoman elite who never learned Arabic. His officers were, for the most part, Turks or Circassians, and although they identified themselves with Muhammad Ali's Egypt, they would have never thought of themselves as Arabs, an Arab movement. Eventually, he would become a broken man because his foreign ambitions had collapsed. With many agreements now, one agreement forced upon him by Europe was the Anglo-Turkish Commercial Convention of 1838, which would allow British products to enter into Europe. These products were cheaper and of better quality than what his factories could produce, so they were able to enter Egypt with an 8% duty tariff. This meant, among other things, the inevitable collapse of Egyptian industry. Think of sanctions, think of protective tariffs, and so on. Anyway, this demonstrates first many things about trade and so on, but what becomes clear by now is that the Christian powers in the Islamic Near East were willing to intervene whenever they felt their interests were threatened. The Ottoman Sultan's European possessions were lost, one by one, but these same powers, the Christian powers, began to seize the Arab provinces now. And the first to do this was not Britain, it was France. Let's go back a little bit to the North African coast, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. Formerly very prosperous North African coast, they also began to suffer a period of disastrous decline. The countryside of the Berbers, as I said, Tunisia, Algiers, Morocco, which had flourished under the Romans, actually, and also during the first 3 centuries of Arab rule, began to decline. Many reasons: Bedouin invasions, the irrigation systems had collapsed, whole villages had disappeared, and the Berbers took to the hills and remained there. It was only in eastern Algeria and Tunisia, helped by the influx at the time of the Andalusian Muslim people expelled from Spain in 1492, that the once prosperous Mediterranean-style agriculture survived. Here is important because we are now they are not able to fight the European powers, and now we enter into the corsair, the pirates. That would be, guerrilla warfare, as it were. And let me read you about the pirates from 26. Okay, from this book, The Arabs, by Peter Mansfield. The consequences for the Mediterranean world of the Catholic reconquest of Spain and Portugal and the expulsion of the Moors were to last for 2 centuries or more. Fearing a counterattack by the Moors, Spain and Portugal carried the war into Africa with raids and the seizure of ports such as Tangier, Melilla, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain and Portugal were much more concerned with their empires in the New World and Asia, So the Moroccan dynasties were able to recover these possessions. Only the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla remained on the North African coast today. The answer of the North African Arabs to the raids by Spain and Portugal was not to launch a counter-invasion, of which they were not capable, but to wage a prolonged war against the shipping of any Christian state in the Mediterranean. The men who did this were the corsairs, and their ships were privateers, which meant that they were owned and manned by individuals but permitted and indeed encouraged to attack the shipping of any state with which their government happened to be at war. This proviso was often loosely interpreted, and the corsairs were essentially pirates. It was their activity which gave the North African Barbary states such a fearsome reputation in Europe. But the famous seamen of the Christian states were hardly any different. Thus, when Sir Francis Drake, the greatest of heroes of British schoolboys, set out on one of his famous voyages to the New World in a ship which was fully equipped for war, he had no commission from Queen Elizabeth's government because England and Spain, although not on friendly terms, were not at war. He merely felt, as he put it, the general license of the times would be his justification. Christian captives of the Barbary corsairs were sometimes treated appallingly and sold as slaves. After the fall of Granada in 1492, the remaining 2 or 3 million Muslims were given the choice of emigration or conversion to Christianity. Those who chose to remain were only nominally converted, and in 1610 the remainder of the Moriscos, as they were called, were forcibly expelled. The Berber word is the word is derived from Berber, the brothers Barbarossa, corsairs who founded the Algerian state in the early 16th century, were probably of Albanian origin, like Muhammad Ali of Egypt. The most famous of these slaves was, of course, Cervantes, the writer of Don Quixote. The poor man had fought at Lepanto, had lost an arm, and then was slave for 5 years. Anyway, let's go back to Morocco. Although Morocco preserved its independence, the Algerians and the Tunisians called in the rising power of Muslim Turkey to their aid and eventually came under Turkey's dominion and control. The European navies would become increasingly effective and the Berber states declined. Whereas there were 35,000 Christian captives in the prisons of Algiers in the 17th century, those were only 35,000 Christian captives in the prisons of Algiers in the 17th century. There were only 1,200 when the British Admiral Lord Exmouth bombarded the city in 1816. The population fell from 100,000 at its height in the 17th century to about 40,000 at the time of the French occupation in 1830. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Corsair pirates were no more than a minor irritation for Europe. The last Western power to seriously split by the pirates. Split? No, I'm not reading. The last Western power to be seriously in confrontation was the newly independent United States of America. It had no navy at the time. It could not profit or protect its shipping, which had been guarded until then by Britain when it was a colony. Therefore, the United States, these young United States, negotiated treaties with the Berber states, under which its shipping would have protection in return for payment of money and goods. That's kind of the mafia thing. Okay, I'll protect you, you give me money. But, however, those agreements broke down always because the United States would not meet its payments at the agreed time. And the Berber states raised their demands for protection money. It was demands such as this by the ruler of Tripoli that provoked a war, actually, from 1801 to 1805. The most notorious action of the war was the march from Alexandria by the U.S. consul in Tripoli, William Eaton, with a force that included some U.S. Marines. In brackets, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, yeah, okay. And this was with the aim of deposing the ruler Karamanli and replace him with a rival named Hamed. Okay, so we are into regime change. Okay. It was a failure, but General Eaton went into history as the colorful symbol of the first U.S. military intervention in the Middle East. He was rather hawkish in outlook. It sounds to me as if he sounds like another General Patton. Let me quote 131, let me see. He said, "Shall America," he asked, "who, when in an infant state, destitute of all apparatus of war, without discipline and without funds, dare to resist the whole force of the lions then of Great Britain to establish her freedom, now that she has acquired manhood, resources, and experience, bring her humiliation to the basest dog kennel of barbary?" Goodness gracious. A footnote here. But General Eaton also professed his belief that there was an affinity between Islam and American religion. He once told some Arab sheikhs that God had promised a separate heaven to Americans, but in this they would be free, if they wish, to make up parties to visit the paradise of Muhammad or the heaven of the papists. I think he's just bullshitting here. Okay, the sheikhs were hugely amused, of course, but said they doubted whether he would be able to visit the paradise of Muhammad unless he had become a sincere Muslim during his lifetime. Do you see here some Arab diplomacy here? Okay. Now, most part of the Arab world were to come under European occupation, but in no case, except possibly the Italian colonization of Libya, was such a form of total domination attempted, partly because of rivalries between European powers. Each of them watched the other to see that they would not annex territories too close to their own vital interests. Also because the spirit of imperialism itself had changed and became a little bit more, let's say, sophisticated. instead of direct colonial government, advantages were seen in indirect rule, which left most of the indigenous institutions intact, but merely ensured the physical dominion of the territory. The next European encroachment on the Arab world was at the opposite end now, the toe of the Arabian Peninsula. Britain, concerned as always with the protection of the sea route to India, decided to establish its own staging post, as it were. Now we can call it a base, at Aden. It had a flourishing trade and splendid fortifications in Roman times, but was now in considerable decay when Europe, this time the Portuguese fleet, first attacked it in the 16th century. When the British took it, it was no more than a fishing village of 500 inhabitants. The pretext was that the local ruler had committed some acts of piracy. Nominally, southern Arabia was part of the Ottoman Empire, but the Sultan was in no position to fight back. It was to form a base from which Britain steadily extended its influence into the tribal hinterland and northwards into the Persian Gulf. Syria was next. The 10 years of Egyptian rule under Ibrahim Pasha from 1831 to 1840 had brought disturbing changes to this conservative region. He had centralized and improved the administration, introduced conscription, established the public education system, and actually allowed Catholic and, for the most part, Catholic, but also some Protestant schools to continue to operate. We're talking about Syria, Ibrahim Pasha. He even tried to establish the principle of equality between Christians and Muslims. But the increased taxation that the reforms required, conscription, and the attempt to take away arms from civilians were unpopular. And when he was forced out of Syria in 1840, the people rose to help the Ottoman forces against him. The manner in which the Ottoman rule was reimposed was disastrous. Even when the empire had been at its height and its administration effective, the mountains of Lebanon had been left largely to themselves under their local ruling dynasties. The system was based on an understanding between the Druses, who were mainly landlords, and the equally independent-minded Maronite Catholic peasants. Let me read you. The Druses are an occult sect, an offshoot of the Ismailis, from whom they parted company in the early 11th century when they accepted the Fatimid Caliph Hakim as the final incarnation of the deity. The Maronites are a unite church which reaccepted the authority of Rome in the early 18th century in return for the right to retain its Oriental rites and customs. It is still widely believed in Lebanon, although without any hard historical evidence, that these Maronites were encouraged and supported by the French and the Druses by the British. Okay. This system the Ottomans now set to destroy in order to be able to impose direct rule on Mount Lebanon. And this task was made easier because the Druze landlords were already alarmed by the growth and the strength of the Catholic Maronites who, through their contact, through their schools, their contact with Europe, were undergoing a cultural revival. The attempt by the Druze to impose their authority led to the Civil War of 1860, in which many Christians were massacred. Let me see. Okay. And when these events had repercussions in further massacres of Catholics in Damascus, the powers of Europe then intervened. Let me quote here. The Algerian hero Abdelkader, by now in exile in Damascus, used his authority to protect the lives of several thousands of Christians. The French presented him with a medal inscribed with the words, quote, Amir of North Africa, defender of Arab nationality, protector of oppressed Christians. The Emperor Napoleon III sent an army which landed at Beirut and stationed troops in the main square, still known to some as the Place des Canons. A conference of 5 powers, Britain, Russia, France, Austria, and Prussia, was held and agreed on a new arrangement, which the Porte had no choice but to accept, whereby Mount Lebanon became a specially privileged district, or Sanjak, detached from the Vilayet of Damascus, with a clear Maronite majority, a Christian governor and chief of police. Ties between Europe and this small but crucial portion of the Ottoman Empire were naturally strengthened by these events. Now let me go on for a little bit longer about the Suez Canal. Give you a little bit of history there. Until the middle of the 19th century, a direct confrontation between British and French interest in the Near East had been avoided. France had sympathized with Muhammad Ali but had withdrawn from backing him against Palmerston's decision to put a stop to his ambitions. On the other hand, Britain recognized and accepted both France's special role as protector of the Christians of the Levant and its conquest of Algeria. Both Britain and France supported the general policy of maintaining the existence of the Ottoman Empire as a break to the ambitions of Russia, and had even joined as allies with the Ottoman Sultan in the Crimean War of 1852-54. However, the danger of a direct clash between Britain and France now arose over Napoleon's most important country, Egypt, which acquired an immensely increased significance for all the powers through the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. As we have seen, Napoleon was keenly interested in the building of a Suez Canal, but rejected it as unfeasible. For similar reasons, the British government, although its own engineers' report in 1830 said that it was technically possible, was strongly opposed to the idea, foreseeing correctly that it would ultimately force Britain to occupy Egypt in order to protect its precious imperial route to India. as Lord Palmerston remarked, and I quote, it's a famous quote, "We do not want Egypt or wish it for ourselves, any more than any rational man with an estate in the north of England and a residence in the south would have wished to possess all the inns on the North Road. All he could want would have been that the inns should be well kept, always accessible, and furnishing him, when he came, with mutton chops and post horses." An inn, well kept, a stopover, a hotel. All right. So French interest was, I love the way that the British, in these days, however much you may disagree with them from a distance, they could talk. Goodness gracious. Okay. French interest was maintained, and in the early 1830s, their vice-consul in Egypt, a young genius named Ferdinand de Lesseps, became concerned with a canal scheme which had the support of Muhammad Ali Pasha. However, the Lesseps had to wait until 1854, when Said, one of Muhammad Ali's sons, who had been his boyhood friend, became Pasha of Egypt, before he could sign an agreement under which the canal company which he had formed could build and operate the canal. England still kept up the struggle and used all possible pressure on the Ottoman Sultan, but who still had to give his consent, to prevent the work from starting. But the Lesseps had the steadfast support of the Emperor Napoleon III, and the cutting of the canal finally began in 1859. Said Pasha died in 1863 and was succeeded by his nephew Ismail, a man of intelligence, vision, and energy, but of disastrous mismanagement in financial matters. His extravagance earned him the title of Ismail the Magnificent, but destroyed Egypt's independence. Ismail was quite capable of seeing the immense significance of the canal for Egypt and the rest of the world. Work on the canal was pushed ahead until it was opened in great pomp and splendor by the French Empress Eugenie in 1869. England had by now fully accepted the inevitable, and the Prince and Princess of Wales were among those who attended the opening. However, England's continued pressure on the Sultan to withhold his final approval for the canal had eventually forced Ismail to accept the decision of a commission of arbitration headed by Napoleon III, which intended to settle the status of the Suez Canal Company in Egypt once and for all. The emperor's decision meant that in return for the company's relinquishment of its right to use free forced labor and of various lands and navigation rights on the Suez Isthmus, Ismail, and therefore Egypt, had to pay a crippling sum of compensation. Moreover, the company's concession ran for 99 years from the date of opening, 1869. Its status in Egypt was now secure and internationally guaranteed. It had all the means of developing into an autonomous state within Egypt. This was a problem for the future. The immediate effect of Napoleon III's award was to sink Ismail and Egypt more deeply into debt to European bond dealers. Moreover, by means of heavy bribes to the Ottoman Sultan, Ismail about this time secured his ambition of making himself a virtually independent sovereign with the title of Khedive or Viceroy, and the right to raise loans and grant concessions in Egypt's name without reference to the port. These not only increased the debts further, but made them the liability of the Egyptian state. Instead of extending Egypt's independence, Ismail was ensuring its destruction. The irony was that the positive social and economic achievements of Ismail's reign were considerable. Ports were extended, railways laid, new canals dug, and over 1 million acres reclaimed from the desert. More money was spent on education, and the first government's girls' school in the Ottoman Empire was founded. Perhaps of greatest importance was that the judicial system was radically changed by the introduction of mixed courts, which ended the immunity of Europeans to a major part of civil law. European observers were astonished to find Egypt acquiring many of the aspects of an advanced 19th century state. In January 1876, the Alexandria correspondent of the Times could write, "Egypt is a marvelous instance of progress. She has advanced as much in 70 years as many other countries have done in 500. And Ismail could claim, "My country is no longer Africa. We are now part of Europe." It was Ismail's financial folly, which his creditors were ready to exploit to the full, that made Egypt a European protectorate. As Palmerston had foreseen, Britain now had a powerful direct interest in Egypt, the roadside inn on the route to India. The interest acquired a solid financial basis in 1875, when the British Prime Minister Disraeli, with the help of a loan arranged by the London Rothschilds, bought the desperate Ismail's 44% share in the Suez Canal Company. This daring coup delighted most Europeans except the French, who were now the principal rivals of the British in Africa. Henceforth, Britain and France would be scrutinizing every move of the other in Egypt. When Ismail asked for a British financial advisor, France sent one also. Seeing no alternative, the two men cooperated in presenting proposals for reform which amounted to the imposition of an Anglo-French control of Egypt's finances. This dual control, as it was called, endeavored to retrieve the situation, but it was now hopeless. While the bondholders would not accept any reduction in their rate of interest, which was the only way of reducing the intolerable burden of Egypt's national debt, no more revenues could be squeezed in taxes out of the poor fellahim, the peasants, rural peasants. Britain and France then decided that since the source of the trouble was Ismail's unlimited power, and the way in which he treated Egypt as his personal property, the solution was to make him delegate some of his power to responsible ministers and hand over his vast personal estates, 20% of Egypt's cultivated land, in return for a fixed royal salary or civil list. And wisely, Britain and France insisted that an Englishman and a Frenchman should be included among the responsible ministers. It was therefore easy for Ismail to turn the tables by blaming Egypt's financial difficulties on the ministers who had been forced upon him. When Egyptian army officers who had not been paid for months became mutinous, Ismail dismissed the government with its European ministers and appointed his own. Britain and France still shrunk from direct intervention in Egypt, if only because it would have required a degree of cooperation between them for which they were not prepared. But their hand was forced when the Austrian and German governments intervened to protest at Ismail's new government's proposal to reduce temporarily the rate of interest payments on the national debt to 5%. Britain and France put pressure on the Ottoman Sultan to order Ismail to abdicate in favor of his son, Tewfik. The Ottoman government was also in appalling financial straits, and the Sultan was in no position to refuse. On the 30th of June 1879, Ismail, after collecting his crown jewels and some £3 million in cash, sailed for Alexandria on his yacht, the Marusha. 83 years later, his grandson Farouk, the last king of Egypt, was to live in much the same way. Ismail had gone, but Egypt's problems remained, and the weak and colorless Tewfik was no man to cope with them. His position was now much more difficult because the arbitrary oppression of his father's regime had finally provoked the formation of a national movement among the long-suffering Egyptians. It was probably inevitable that the vanguard of this movement should be formed by those officers of the army created by Ibrahim Pasha, who were of true Egyptian or Fellahin origin and resented the domination of the Turco-Circassians, who held all the key positions in the country. They found a leader in the massive and dignified figure of Colonel Arabi, the son of a small farmer of Lower Egypt. As the Times pointed out on the 12th of September 1881, quote, "The army, we must remember, is the only native institution which Egypt now owns. All else has been invaded and controlled and transformed by the accredited representatives of France and England." End of quote. At the beginning, the army was only concerned with its own grievances, its missing pay, and the unfair promotion of the Turco-Circassians, but when Arabi and his followers successfully combined to force the Khedive to dismiss the deeply unpopular and reactionary Circassian Minister of War who had tried to arrest them, the army became the focus of a national movement which included all classes of Egyptian society, big and small landowners, traders, craftsmen, and ulama, the scholars of Islam. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it here, and I will resume at the very end in the next chapter what happened to Europe and move on. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.